When Hitler's armies stormed across the Soviet border in June 1941, the Red Army collapsed in chaos. In just a few months, millions of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. Entire divisions vanished. The Germans seemed unstoppable, and yet somehow the Soviets replaced them, again and again. By the end of the war, they had raised the largest army in human history, over 34 million soldiers. How did a country so devastated keep finding men to fight? How did they build a war machine that could absorb the greatest losses in history and still push all the way to Berlin? It began with fear, and it ended with survival. The Soviet Union was vast. Before the invasion, it held almost 190 million people, more than Germany and all its allies combined. But numbers alone didn't guarantee victory. The key was mobilization. From the moment German tanks crossed the border, Stalin ordered the entire country onto a war footing. Factories, farms, schools, and cities were drafted into the struggle. It became what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War. Every man between 18 and 50 could be summoned at any moment, and they were. Conscription waves swept through the countryside. Local party officials were given quotas, and failure wasn't an option. In villages from the Baltic to Siberia, men were rounded up, sometimes in the middle of the night, handed rifles, and loaded onto trains bound for the front. Some had no uniforms, no boots, not even proper weapons, but they went. The Soviet system ran on fear as much as patriotism. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, enforced the draft with ruthless efficiency. Dodging conscription meant prison or execution. Families of deserters could lose their homes, rations, or be sent to labor camps. When you live under a regime that controls every aspect of life, volunteering often isn't a choice, it's survival. But fear wasn't the only force driving men to the front. When the German invasion, Operation Barbarossa, reached Soviet soil, it unleashed atrocities that shocked the world. Civilians massacred, towns burned, families wiped out. For millions of ordinary Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, this was no longer Stalin's war. It was personal. They weren't fighting for communism. They were fighting for home, for family, for revenge. That emotional fire became one of the Red Army's greatest weapons. Women played a role no other major power dared to match. As men went to the front, women stepped into every gap they left behind. They built tanks, forged artillery shells, harvested crops, drove trains, and even picked up rifles. There were female snipers, machine gunners, and entire regiments of night bombers flying ancient biplanes through German searchlights. Every woman who joined freed a man to fight. Every man who fell was replaced again and again until the front stopped moving west. The early disasters of 1941 forced Stalin to improvise on a scale no leader had ever attempted. As German forces advanced, the Soviets evacuated whole cities, dismantling factories bolt by bolt and shipping them thousands of miles east to the Urals and Siberia. Along with the machines went millions of workers, many of them young men of fighting age. Once resettled, they were registered, trained, and drafted. What looked like retreat was, in truth, the creation of a second Soviet state hidden behind the mountains, safe from German bombs, ready to feed the war machine. By 1942, while Germany was stretched thin in the Soviet winter, the USSR was rebuilding faster than anyone believed possible. New armies appeared almost overnight, each one filled with fresh conscripts, often given just a few weeks of training before being thrown into battle. At Stalingrad, some units went forward with more courage than ammunition, but they went forward nonetheless. The Soviet leadership measured men the way others measured bullets, by numbers. They knew that if they could keep replacing what they lost, they could grind the Wehrmacht down. It was a war of endurance, not finesse. And in that kind of war, population mattered more than precision. Behind the front lines, propaganda fueled the cycle. Radio broadcasts, posters, and newsreels reminded citizens of what was at stake. The slogans were everywhere: everything for the front, everything for victory. Songs played on village loudspeakers, mothers sent sons to war with tears and pride, and Stalin's image loomed over them all like a grim father demanding sacrifice. For those who broke under the strain, there was no mercy. Retreat without orders could mean death by firing squad. Penal battalions, made up of deserters or disgraced officers, were sent into the most hopeless assaults, clearing minefields with their bodies. Behind them stood blocking detachments of NKVD troops, ready to shoot anyone who ran. It was a machine that fed on its own fear, but kept moving forward, no matter the cost. Wounded soldiers were rarely lost to the system. Soviet medicine was brutal, but effective. If a man could walk, he could fight. Hospitals near the front worked around the clock to patch up the injured and send them back. By some estimates, half of all wounded Red Army soldiers returned to combat at least once. Some returned 2 or 3 times. The result was an army that never seemed to run out of men. When Soviet forces finally began retaking occupied territory in 1943 and 1944, the recruitment machine only grew stronger. Each liberated region provided new soldiers: Ukrainians, Belarusians, Balts, men who had lived under German occupation were drafted on the spot. Many had no time to rest or reunite with their families. They were handed weapons and marched straight back toward the front lines that had just passed through their villages. It was a cycle that never stopped. Losses created vacancies, and vacancies created new conscripts. In Stalin's logic, every man was replaceable, but victory was not. The industrial miracle behind this manpower was equally relentless. Those relocated factories in the east began pouring out tanks, rifles, and artillery faster than Germany could destroy them. By 1943, Soviet industry was producing 3 times as many tanks as the entire Axis combined. Each machine represented another recruit armed and ready to fight. Where the Wehrmacht grew weaker, the Red Army grew stronger. The psychological transformation was astonishing. In 1941, Soviet soldiers had fled in panic from German panzers. By 1943, they hunted those same tanks through the ruins of Kursk and Kharkov. Every fresh wave of recruits carried the memory of the ones who'd fallen before them, and with each victory, their belief hardened. The fear that once drove them was replaced by something colder and more powerful: momentum. Even the way the Soviets counted losses revealed their mindset. Where Western armies might pull back to regroup, the Red Army advanced, no matter the cost. Divisions destroyed one week were rebuilt the next. Commanders learned to fight with whoever remained, trusting that replacements would arrive within days. The human toll was staggering: over 8.5 million soldiers killed, and perhaps twice that number wounded, but the system never broke. Part of the reason was that the Soviet Union framed the war not as conquest, but as existence. To lose meant annihilation. They had seen what happened in occupied territories: the executions, the starvation, the forced labor. Every man understood what defeat meant for his family. That knowledge turned desperation into endurance. By 1944, when the Red Army began its final push westward, the Soviets had created a manpower engine that seemed endless. Fresh divisions poured across the Dnieper, through Poland, into the Balkans, and finally towards the heart of Germany. Behind every rifleman stood another ready to replace him. Behind every victory lay the graves of those who made it possible. When they reached Berlin in 1945, the Red Army had more than 6 million men on the front lines. The reserves waiting behind them numbered in the millions more. The soldiers who raised the red flag over the Reichstag were the survivors of a system that had consumed an entire generation but achieved the impossible. No other nation in history had ever mobilized so many people for so long. No other army had endured such losses and still found the strength to win. The price was almost unimaginable. Families emptied, villages without men, children orphaned, an entire society scarred forever. But from that suffering came victory. After the war, Soviet leaders called it the Great Patriotic Triumph. But for the men and women who lived through it, it was something darker, a testament to human endurance under the most brutal conditions imaginable. They hadn't fought because they wanted to. They fought because there was no choice. That is how the Soviet Union raised army after army, division after division, until nothing was left but victory. Fear kept them in line, patriotism kept them moving, and survival kept them fighting. When the guns finally fell silent, the Soviet Union had lost more than 26 million people, soldiers and civilians alike. But it had achieved what once seemed impossible. It had destroyed Hitler's empire and marched its flag across the ruins of Berlin. The secret wasn't luck or brilliance, it was endurance. The will to keep replacing, rebuilding, and resisting long after any other nation would have broken. A system built on terror, powered by faith, and driven by the unshakable knowledge that surrender meant extinction. That's how the Soviets kept fighting. That's how they found the strength to turn disaster into victory, by transforming every tragedy into fuel for the next army that would rise from the ashes of the last.